Thank you for coming out this rainy morning. We have a new presentation today, something I've been working on for a few months, called A History of Kingsville as Told Through Maps, because I found that for those of you who don't know, I research old buildings, old properties in Kingsville. That's kind of what I do, and in doing that, I've over the years collected quite a few resources, including maps. And then I thought, you know what, this would be a really interesting way of telling the history of Kingsville, and it gives you a visual, and just to show you how it kind of rolled out and developed from the early years. So the first slide is Kingsville as it looks in 2024. This is taken off of the town website. You can go on and you can zoom in and you can get all these different aerial views from past years. It's a great tool that I use for sure. So we're going to go really probably farther back than you thought we were going to go. And we're going to go to a map from 1650. So the earliest maps, this isn't the earliest of this area, but this is the earliest map that actually showed all the Great Lakes. And it was done by Sanson, and it was a very popular map at the time showing New France. And this is the same map, but someone else has duplicated it, so it makes it a little bit more clear. So Nicholas Sanson was the geographer to the King of France and was one of the most eminent map makers of his day. And this was the first map to depict the Great Lakes in some sort of recognizable form. So the earliest maps were done by the French and the Jesuit missionaries, and basically started from the St. Lawrence and bringing it all the way up. So that's why we have the Great Lakes. And we can kind of see in 1650 the part of the areas that had been claimed, but also somewhat mapped out as well. So we're going to jump ahead to this map from 1713. And this shows the treaties of Utrecht, which ended the War of Spanish Succession. The war was from 1701 to 1714. So after this war, and so a lot of these wars kind of happened over in Europe, but they had ramifications in the New World or the colonies. So in this one, after this treaty, and it was a series of treaties, in North America, France, according to the treaty that was ratified, recognized the British's sovereignty over the Iroquois in this area. Although there's another name for that, it's not complete sovereignty, but because the Iroquois were still able to do some self-determination, but definitely it recognized the connection with the British. And they ceded Nova Scotia and its claim to Newfoundland and the territories in Rupert's Land. And so you can see Rupert's Land is up towards the north. So it's funny, when I was going through a lot of these maps, how many of them were redrawn after wars or treaties. So we'll have another one, which is from the Treaty of Paris, that formally ended the 7 Years' War. And the reason why I'm going through these old maps is because our area, Essex, Gosfield, Kingsville, we were all involved in these maps. So the 7 Years' War was a global conflict that involved most of the European great powers. The opposing alliances were led by Great Britain and France, each seeking to establish a global preeminence at the expense of the other country. So with this war, at this treaty, ending the 7 Years' War, France then recognized the sovereignty of Britain over Canada, and France lost all its territories in the mainland North America, except for the territory of Louisiana, west of the Mississippi. So at this time, they had a lot of French settlers still there. So French Canadians who chose not to leave had to become British at this time. And in order for them to serve in public offices, they were required to swear an oath to the king that contained specific provisions rejecting the Catholic faith. So this is the beginnings of the animosity between the French and the English. So this effectively prevented large numbers of French Canadians from participating in local governments. And we'll see how that ramification continues on. So now we're going to the Quebec Act of 1774, and you can see that there is the line separating the British colonies and then the province of Quebec. We now have a province of Quebec, which we were part of. And so one of the principal components of this act was the expansion of the province's territory. So we did kind of go a little bit further up north, but it also, with this act, it removed the reference to the Protestant faith from the oath of allegiance and guaranteed free practice of Catholicism and restored the church's power to impose compulsory contributions to the church, which was 1/10 of your annual earnings. Now, if we see the date here, which is 1774, this act became one of the factors in starting of the American Revolution. And so this is a map that was redrawn at the Treaty of Versailles after the Revolutionary War in America. And the Revolutionary War was from 1775, so a year after the Quebec Act, and then it lasted until 1783. And the treaty dictated that the British would lose their 13 colonies, so we see the United States at the bottom, and mark the end of the first British Empire. So now we're going a little bit more localized here. And we're talking about the Constitutional Act of 1791. So the act reformed the government of the province of Quebec to accommodate that, among other loyalists that were already there, the 10,000 United Empire loyalists who arrived from the United States following the American Revolution. And as we continue on, you'll know that this area is made up of a lot of those Empire loyalists. So the province of Quebec was divided in two when the act took effect. So the largely unpopulated western half became Upper Canada, which is now southern Ontario, and the eastern half became Lower Canada, which is now southern Quebec. And the reason for the names is that it was your location of the St. Lawrence. So as you're coming down the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Lower Canada was Quebec, and then as you went further up the St. Lawrence, you got to Upper Canada. So now this is the province of Quebec divided. So now we're hitting into the 1840s, which was a response of the rebellions of 1837 and 1838. So these rebellions, I won't get too much into it, but the first occurred in Lower Canada in Quebec, and then in Upper Canada, and actually did reach this area as well. And these rebellions were against the government at the time. They really felt like the British had a stranglehold on all sorts of governance in the country. So this was the response after the rebellion, and it was redone. So Upper Canada and Lower Canada were merged into the province of Canada. And it was under this belief of uniting these two provinces, that peace could be achieved by ensuring a loyal English majority in British North America, as well as anglicizing the French Canadians. And I think we know how well that turned out. So Upper Canada, with its British and Protestant majority, was growing more rapidly than Lower Canada with the French Canadian and Catholic majority. So it was hoping that merging the two colonies, the French Canadian culture presence in North America would gradually disappear through assimilation. Oh, sorry. And finally, with these sets of maps is the Constitution Act in 1867. So the British North American Act, they're interchangeable, they're both known as the same name, was enacted by the British Parliament in 1867 and came into effect on July 1st, 1867. It provided for a union or confederation of 3 of the 5 British North American colonies into a federal state with a parliamentary system modeled on that of Britain. The 3 colonies were Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the province of Canada, but then it was divided into Ontario and Quebec. So that's how we have Ontario and Quebec today. And then, of course, you know, as years went on, Canada got bigger with the other provinces, but we're not getting into that today because it doesn't affect us locally. So now we're going to be focusing on local maps. So just to review from the previous maps, our area itself started out after colonization as New France, and then it became the province of Quebec, then it became Upper Canada, then we became province of Canada, and finally the province of Ontario within Canada. So that really, those dates really helped me as a researcher, because sometimes when I'm looking at documents, and for researchers out there, you guys might find this as well, you'll find certificates that are like, you know, given out and the head would be the province of Quebec. And that will give me a timeline of when that was issued or what context it was issued under. You know, because it's very odd to think of us originally being the province of Quebec at one time. So this is an early survey done by Patrick McNiff. It's from 1791. And I'll tell you straight ahead, McNiff was not known as being a good surveyor. He kept getting fired all the time. So this is loosely, but it's a nice early picture of what this Essex County looked like before it was Essex County. This is the drawing, but in a book I was able to find, someone had redrawn it so we can really understand this map a little bit better. So if I want to point out a few of the things. So the lower part of Essex County, which will be like Colchester and going into Gosfield, it does say a settlement of loyalists and disbanded troops. We'll be getting into that. The proposed town of Amherstburg. So at this time, Amherstburg wasn't a town yet. I like the one in the center where it's the old beaver pond. So it's interesting, maybe like a little east of Olinda maybe, because Olinda sits up quite a bit higher. Swamp, marsh, a sandy ridge producing nothing but a few scattering trees of white oak. And we do see that Mill Creek, Cedar Creek, and then off of Colchester, McGregor's Creek. So that's an early reference to the McGregor name. So this map was kind of being produced because we had, this area, Upper Canada, had gotten John Graves Simcoe as their first lieutenant governor. So he was really going to pull the province of Ontario and get it organized. So this was an early survey to see what was there. And specifically, this map was called for because they wanted documentation of where the windmills were. So whereas when we think about Sandwich, you know, west of Windsor, we think of the Sandwich windmill. Well, along the east, those X's were all windmills. That's how many windmills this area had in 1791. So this is a nice early map. Again, when we're looking at road systems later in the presentation, this shows you the early Indigenous and pre-Indigenous trails or vestige trails. So you have the one that goes along the south part of the county, and then you kind of have Trail A, which went on to be Talbot Road, and that's because it kind of follows that natural ridge that happens in the landscape of the county. You know, hence Northridge, it goes right through there. And then Trail B that comes down, that is like the Graham Side Road. It kind of follows the Ruscombe River, and it shows some of these early trails. And it's interesting because in Michigan, if you look at the history of their roads in Michigan, you get some bureaucrats that come in and they want straight roads. They want to clear through and they want a nice grid and everything. And Michigan tried to do that and then later on realized it was too difficult and why don't we just build on what's always already there? So we definitely did that here in this area. And we'll see as we go on how we've utilized those earlier trails. Interesting is that where the number 2 is, just under Trail D, it does say that there was 2 Indian entrenchments in Gosfield Township from 1794. And then there was a village on Cedar Creek entrenched in Gosfield South, and that's number 3, so just where Cedar Creek was. So actually, we don't have a lot of documentation about this except for these kinds of maps. That Cedar Creek was kind of the first area where people kind of populated, and we'll get into that with the Loyalists and everything, because they actually had like a bar there and they had a mill, and it was a happening place at one point. So before the whole county was kind of mapped out, and when the French were in charge of this area, they did start surveying off different parts of the county. And the long, skinny lots were definitely the French way of surveying. And generally, farm lots were 200 acres. So even the blocky ones to the right at the bottom, and they're all kind of around 200 acres, more or less. And so Detroit was a really big happening place. So the early farm lots were definitely in Sandwich and Windsor, what is today Windsor. And then as they kind of came along, that's when we had disbanded troops from the Revolutionary War. We had United Empire Loyalists that didn't want to fight the British, that they came to this area. So John Graves Simcoe, the lieutenant governor, who was a military man himself, he had decided, you know what, if people are coming here and they already have the skill set of being, troops, some war experience, We have the south part of this area right here that we may need to defend at one point. So that's why they gave all these lots down on the south part to the disbanded, or the troops that came over here, Butler's Rangers you'll hear about, and some other Empire Loyalists. So they started off, and then you can kind of see, Fort Malden would be over there, and then big chunks of land were kind of given out to some of the soldiers. For instance, they were 200 lots, but some soldiers would get like 1,000 acres. So it wasn't one lot per person. It was definitely, some people got more than just the 200 acres. So this is a close-up of the same map, and this is kind of the beginning of Kingsville. So we have the long, skinny lots that were first done. There was 97 lots that were plotted out for Empire Loyalists and for troops. And then it reached all the way to actually where Division Street is now. And then there was like kind of a second wave, and they decided that they were going to open up a little bit more of the area. And then that was surveyed out just along the shoreline, and that's the English Way. And so then that's where it starts number 1, going over to 12. That is from Division Street all the way to the town line. So that's how the earliest parts, because you wanted access to water, because you had the shipping, and then you had the irrigation and everything. So like I said, we're getting into our Lieutenant Governor. He wants to organize the whole province of Ontario. And so this is part of a greater map, and this one is from 1800. And this coincides with some legislation called an Act for the Division of Upper Canada into Counties. And so took all of, he went and had surveyors go out for the whole county, or for the whole province at the time, and then they divide these into counties, and then the counties would then be divided into townships. And the townships were divided out using the following formula. So townships located on navigable rivers were 9 miles wide and 12 miles deep, while townships in the interior of the province were squared off in 10-mile by 10-mile allotments. So that's how townships were planned out. So if you get past the peninsula that we're in now, most of the original townships are all squares. But we got down here, and actually it's interesting, when I read this, Gosfield Township, the original township, is pretty darn close to 9 miles wide and 12 miles deep. And so this is an early map from 1800 from David William Smith. And this map would grow and be revisited many times, which they did with maps. So we have a later map done by the same gentleman based on his original map. And this is from 1818. And I brought this in because you'll notice the addition of roads. So we'll be seeing some roads going along, around where the waterways are. And then you see he has indicated that there's the settlements of Loyalists. And actually, I'll go back for a sec. If you see this 1800 map, where Amherstburg is, it says proposed fort and proposed town. And by 1818, we have Malden, we have Amherstburg, and we can see the Fort Malden right there. So we can kind of get an idea through the maps of when that developed itself. Now, this is a map from 1826, and this shows even more roads, and this is kind of the development, how people are kind of getting around in this area. And this does show where Talbot Trail is, or Talbot Road is. And then there is that straight line from Amherstburg all the way to Colchester. And if we see where Colchester, now, Harrow, but Colchester, it actually has on this map, it says Old Fort. And that's something I had no idea about, but according to this map, there was actually a fort there as well. Perhaps it predated the Fort Malden itself. So 1826, and now we're getting into Kingsville, or Gosfield as it was formerly known, and how it was mapped out. So in 1800, you saw William kind of did, counties and townships, and then he went back in 1801, 1802, and him and his team, they went through, and then they turned these into building lots. So this is from 1805, this map is a copy from the 1805 one that shows how Kingsville was originally mapped out. You still have the long skinny ones from the new settlement, which was the United Empire Loyalists, and then you have these blocky ones that were the English way of putting farm lots. So they're the 200-acre farm lots. It's a little bit interesting, and I wish I knew a little bit more about this because it is a bit odd. For instance, you have division that kind of goes down, and it's the separation of the skinny and the French and the English lots. So the French lots start at number 1, and then they go west. So they count 1, 2, 3, 4, west. And then the east lots along the shore starts at lot 1, and then they go all the way to 13. And then if you go up a little bit higher to the second concession on the left side, or the west side, the lots are letters. And they start A, B, C, D, goes all the way to M, but there's no J. So there's an I, and there's no J. And then you go a little bit further up, and then you go back to numbers, but they start at 1, and they go all the way across. So this tells me that maybe McNiff was the one, because I told you he wasn't a very good surveyor, or this might have progressed over time. So maybe they kind of did the first one, and then no one checked the other person's work when they decided or they thought they had a better way of doing it. Now, as you can see, this shows where people had purchased land or put in land grants and they were working the land. They were put on this map to show that they were working the land, and it was kind of assumed at the time. They were working towards getting their crown patent. You can see it was mostly along the lake. And the northern part, not much interest whatsoever. And from previous maps, you'll know that there was the marshes and maybe that old beaver pond. And you can see some of the words kind of going up is actually, those were lots of land that were reserved for the clergy. Because at the time when this happened, you had to have a certain percentage of land had to be given reserved for the clergy and for the crown. So those were the reserved lots, and nothing was really happening there. And then we have the infamous Colonel Talbot, which is a whole presentation onto its own. He became a land speculator. He was allowed to go and redo some of these surveys, and he was encouraging people to come to this area. And so he had a deal with the government that if he sold so much land to a new settler, he would then get more land for himself, and St. Thomas is named after him, and the Talbot settlement, and yeah, Port Talbot, all Colonel Talbot. So he decided that he was going to go back and follow that old indigenous trail and turn that into a road. So he redid the whole area and redid all the lots. So you can kind of see now how the lots kind of come down and they follow the trail and then go into Olinda. Luckily, none of that land had been claimed yet, so he was able to go and just kind of, upset the original survey. So this was done about, over a few years, but about like 1918, and it took a couple of years to do this. This map happens to be from 1832, but it shows you the difference between the original plan for the area and a later plan. So they were just making this up as they went along. So he did refer to the road as Talbot Trail, and all those lots are numbered lots. They're all 3-digit numbers, so it's like 270 or 259, and then say you're on north of Talbot Road, it's lot 270 north of Talbot Road, lot 270 south of Talbot Road. So his name was everywhere. He really liked branding himself. So this is how we kind of know when I'm looking at properties and things like that. This is the map that I'm using as opposed to the map on the left. So now we're getting into how Kingsville's kind of developed itself. And I'm showing the southern part of Gosfield, and these would be the early ports. So there was an early port on Division Street South, but that one wasn't around for very long before it went east to where the Kingsville dock is now. So the first port of this area was a place called Albertville, which is kind of where the Graham Side Road kind of comes down and ends. And if you remember back to the map about the indigenous trails, that was an indigenous trail. So they're utilizing what was already there, and it became kind of the first port where people could dock and then people could ship out and receive items via the lake. So the first post office in Gosfield was established in 1831, and it was actually located in Albertville, but it was called Gosfield Post Office. So at the time, as you know, Albertville, 1831, now we're getting Ruthven, and just north of Ruthven was Olinda, and that's where the iron foundry was. So around the 1830s, 1840s, when they had supplies that they wanted to ship out, they didn't want to have to go to the Albertville dock. They decided to go right down and build their own dock, the Ruthven dock. And actually, apparently, it's better situated. It was easier for navigation. So that became a thriving community of Union. So at the time that now we're establishing, they're getting more people and everything, you have Union is kind of fighting with Albertville, who's going to be the town center, who's going to be the capital. And then some upstarts from Kingsville decide, well, you know what, yeah, Kingsville might be a better thing. Maybe we should do this Kingsville thing. So Colonel King, he got together and he worked with two farmers who own land. So this is Division Street South, Division Line Road, and Main Street West and Main Street East. And so you had Harrington, John Harrington owned the farm on the east of Division Street, and Andrew Stewart owned to the west of Division Street. So he got them together and he said, you know what, why don't we map out a town? And we can try to get ahead of the other communities, really formalize this, because once you have a registered plan, then you can bring that plan and have it registered in Sandwich, and it's now becomes easier to buy land because the lots are already planned out. And so he was able to get this done. So James King, he organized the two farmers, and he actually was the first investor, because this was just, you know, all wooded area right here. And before the plan was even put into place in 1850, he had already bought property there because he really saw the potential growth of this community. So the plan was registered in 1850, and Kingsville was granted a post office in 1852. So it's now Kingsville's on the map. It's still part of Gosfield. It's not a municipality yet, even though they refer to it as the town of Kingsville. It's just kind of the center of Gosfield. So they got ahead of the other communities, and they're a little bit more organized, because we see here that this is a registered plan for Union. Remember, Union and Albertville were fighting a year later than Colonel King's plan. But it's not as elaborate. And you can see the star is where this plan was located in the grand scheme of the whole map. And so this at the bottom has the company store. You know, there was just a few building lots, because the thing about the King plan was the fact that he had a town center for commercial enterprises, but then he had building lots so people would build houses there as well. This had some commercial lots, but mostly not a lot of residential areas for people to buy and build on. And just to let you know that most building lots at the time were measured out in chains, and a chain is 66 feet. And so most lots were 66 feet by 132, or one chain by two chains. And so that's using the British measurement system. So the next community that was trying to organize itself was Ruthven. So Union was earlier than Ruthven, because Ruthven didn't plan this out until 1860. And this is the first part of Ruthven that was planned out, not even Elgin Street, really. And you can see on the map, the star shows you where this plan was. And so this is 1860. And again, you know, not very elaborate. And Northridge. Northridge makes me laugh because it's what, 8 building lots? You can see where Northridge is on the map. Someone got together and they had just made these building lots. I think they were trying to perhaps get their post office back, or something was happening. And the two streets were actually named after two of the farmers at the time. We have Billing on the east side, and the west side is Gilbo. So it's just two farmers got together and created a couple streets for themselves. Now we have Cottam. So Cottam was not until 1877. Again, on the star on the map shows you where that is. This shows a little bit more elaborate. You know, they're a little bit more organized. And this is Laird and Fox Street and Victoria Street, and just and then Bell River Road and Talbot Road right there. So 1877 for Cottam. So we had other communities in Kingsville as well, but those are the only ones that really had those building plans. The rest of the time, if a farmer would sell off a portion of land, he would just describe it in a deed, and it was not very organized. And you could go to him or her, and you could say, oh, you know what, could I have like another 10 feet? Sure, why not? And they would write a whole other deed for another 10 feet. But different areas did have post offices, which means there was kind of either a store there or some sort of center where getting a post office was a really big deal. So some of the post offices are no longer there, so I've included the dates of them. So Gosfield, the one that was in Albertville, it closed in 1877. It lost the battle to become a civic center. And no one here, not many people talk about Albertville too much anymore. Kingsville, 1852, we still have ours. Ruthven still have ours. There was one in Olinda, 1860. It closed in 1914. Northridge is a whole nother story because Northridge was actually in Cottam, and then it got moved and then renamed Cottam on their own, and so that's a whole nother thing. That's why there was the 7-year gap there. Because at the time, sometimes these post offices were in people's houses. So if someone moved and no one else wants to take over the post office moved with them. So, and sometimes they would be in stores. And it's one of my favorite stories about post office naming is there is an area near Malden called Comet. You heard of Comet? Yeah, so it's a small little area. It did have a post office at one time, and the reason why it was called Comet is because it was located in a store, a dry goods store, and one of that gentleman, the postmaster who owned the store, one of his biggest selling items was Comet paper collars. And so he decided to just name it after his most popular item that he sells, early branding. So yeah, so a lot of people could kind of, that's why Ruthven, got to be Ruthven because, first postmaster was Ruthven. And so there was a lot of leniency as far as naming rights. Cottam, we still have one. Albuna, which is upper right, from 1884 to 1914. Arner, which is to the left. And then the Medawas, when we had the Medawas Hotel here, they actually had their own post office. So there's actually, you can find stamps that actually is the Medawas stamp for their post office. And then also include, this is a page from the Kingsville Gosfield Heritage Society's book. And so this is a great page, and this map was done by Jerry Ogle, and it also shows the schools, the different schools. Because that's, it's a nice way to kind of look at all these different communities, because yes, the schools all had numbers, but then they also were known, they also had naming rights. So you got an understanding of, some of the families that were around there. So now we're reaching into Kingsville actually becoming incorporated. So the village of Kingsville was incorporated in 1877. This is the bylaw that was done by Essex County Council. And this is the outline of what the original village of Kingsville looked like. So they wanted to make sure that they included the dock. Of course, the Four Corners, which is, was all mapped out and everything. Definitely wanted to go east so they can make sure they got all of Conklin's land in there. And the Harrington House down there. So yeah, so this is what it looked like early on. And then as development kind of, went outside of the town lines, they would kind of gobble up, different property. When property along Lakeview, where a lot of summer cottages went there and everything, then all of a sudden that became part of the town of Kingsville. So this is the earliest original map of the village of Kingsville. I think, yep. Yeah, that's the next one. Yeah. Okay, so this is interesting because this had to do with Gosfield itself being separated into Gosfield North and Gosfield South. So this happened in 1888, and it was a direct response to Hiram Walker building a railway. So that's why we have an old ad for the old Lake Erie and Detroit River Railway, because he was trying to fundraise to bring this railway through. So he was going to municipalities and saying, I would like bonuses. Can your local governments kind of give me some bonuses? That's what it was referred to as. And he was looking for about $5,000, and then he would bring it through your community. So for that amount of money, Gosfield needed to vote on it. And so when it was voted upon, you had the residents of the northern part of Gosfield saying, yeah, I don't want my tax money going to a railway that I'm not going to, bear fruit from. You know, we have Talbot Road. That's where, you know, most of goods were being transported. Now, if you're doing a railway, yeah, no. And so more people from the north voted in that election, and so the bonus was voted down. So people got together, and so the following year, because the southern part really wanted the railway to come through, so they went ahead and they put on the ballot the following year, 1877, or 1887 rather, to divide into Gosfield North and Gosfield South. You guys can take care of your own situation. And and it was approved. You know, both the whole, all the voters of Kingsville or Gosfield did vote for this division. And you can see onto the right where it kind of comes along and then jags out a little bit. That's the original division, and the township of Gosfield South, the very first thing they did on the first day of election was to approve the bonus to Hiram Walker. So that's how come the railway did end up coming through the southern part and through Gosfield South and through Kingsville. So this is another map of Kingsville, and as you can see, it's expanded quite a bit. You can see the outline going on as things kind of you know, expanded. You know, they wanted to include it in the village of Kingsville. It became a town in 1901, and this had to be approved from the legislature in Ontario. And so they had to get it sponsored, and it had to go before legislature, and it was approved. So Kingsville became a town in 1901. Now, Cottam in Gosfield North. Cottam was kind of like, you know, the center of Gosfield North. And they decided they wanted the residents that were in the main part of Gosfield North in Cottam, they wanted more control over where their tax money went. So they decided that they wanted to be incorporated into a police village. So it's still, it's a separate designate. They're still part of Gosfield North, but they have more control over the Cottam itself. So this was approved through Essex County bylaw. And the important thing to think of is a police village has to be, it has to have at least 150 residents, and the area incorporated can't be more than 500 acres. So it's very specific about what a police village could be. And I love this picture because this is actually written on the back of a Gosfield North letterhead. And this would be the lots. And this is Bell River Road, that's Talbot, and this was some of the town fathers in Cottam sketching out what they wanted the police village to be like. And in fact, that's pretty much the boundary of Cottam itself. So, and you can see that to the right, when you're looking at 272, I think it wanted to go a little bit further, but they had to keep within that, the under 500 acres itself. So now we're getting more modern, where we're looking at amalgamation. So between 1992 and 97, the County of Essex went through a major restructuring. It reduced the county from 21 municipalities down to 7. And so on January 1st, 1999, Kingsville, Gosfield North, and Gosfield South was amalgamated to become the town of Kingsville. And so we're basically back from where we started. Any questions? That's a lot of information, I know. Yes? Yes?
Veronica, on your map, where is, when it says the Brooks Bend Dock, what street would that have been?
That would be Union, as Union goes all the way down.
Okay, right?
Yep.
Oh,
Yep, all the way down.
so where are the Aquarius now? The Waterworks.
Yes, Waterworks.
Yeah.
Yep. That'd be the original Ruthven Dock. Yes, Betsy.
On some of those really early maps, there was a different name for Point Peely, but I couldn't quite make it out from your photo. What is it?
Yeah, well, let's go back and see then. We can go back. You know, it is interesting because Lake Erie was always kind of known as Lake Erie, but it also was Lake Erie or Lake du Chat, which was Cat Lake. So it kind of always had two names. Lake Erie actually is from the Erie tribe or band from the indigenous populations here. But let's see what we can do for Point Pelee. That one you're talking about? Let's see.
Or a couple, yeah.
I think it's always actually been known.
Next one. There was one
Point Pelee,
south-
Point Pelee Island.
No, south.
Oh.
Or Point Pelee, that one.
Okay, there we go.
South.
Foreland.
Foreland.
Yeah. Who knew? Oh, that's the exciting thing about these old maps because they do, well, just like one of the, which one is it? One of the, yeah, look at this 1826. Look at one of the islands. Now, Point Pelee Island is below this, so they're not referring to it, but it's called Hen and Chickens, that little island. I've never heard that one before either.
It says South Foreland again there,
There you go.
doesn't it? I knew I saw it.
Uh-huh. There you go.
Pen and chicks still exist.
Oh, does it?
Yeah.
Oh,
It does, yeah.
and what's on it?
There
Hens and chicks?
yeah,
Is it populated or?
no. History and rum runner days.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
All those islands out there.
Mm.
Al Capone, rum running.
Mm. Well, it's interesting because in Kingsville, the train station was involved with that too. There is a house in Kingsville. George Hall was the station master at the time, and there was a notice in the newspaper that $1,800 worth of alcohol was found in his basement. So if you were bringing in alcohol, the train's the way to go. Don't worry about the lake. Interesting, when I was going through some of these old maps, is how long Cedar Creek have been called. There was maps from the 1700s where Cedar Creek was named. Yeah, oh yeah, I could go through, loads of maps. Yes?
Was there ever a stagecoach line or that type of thing?
Yes,
Railroad?
and that would be more to do with the mail as well. So yes, definitely. So a lot of times the stagecoach would follow where the post offices were. So when Albertville got the post office in 1831, that would have been a stop on the stagecoach going, up towards Toronto.
Talbot Trail was the old road, and that's the old number 3 highway all along Lake Erie to 40.
Yeah, because then Tablet Trail became, as many of you know, it became a toll road. And then it was a corduroy road, and it was a gravel road. And so, yeah, Tablet Trail went through a lot. And then, yeah, it was a lot of good history from that road as well. Yes, Terry?
Do any of the maps show the Caldwell Grant?
I may. See, I do actually, believe it or not, I have more maps than I've included in this. So I'm sure I do have some that show the Caldwell. And they also refer a lot to the Hurons as well. But yeah, after we're done, I'll go through and see if I can find some for you. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for coming out and listening to my presentation on maps.